Alright guys, welcome to Formula 1 News. George Russell on pole for the Las Vegas Grand Prix. Lewis Hamilton believes it should have been his pole today though for Mercedes, but again in Q3, situations start to fall apart for Hamilton. Both of his final laps did not go to plan. Hamilton reckons the car once again was not feeling the same, as we have heard many times this season. Is there some reality behind this? Is it all in Hamilton's head? How will Ferrari next year help? But so many other storylines up and down the grid. Gasly, Verstappen versus Norris, obviously Perez as well. Very much interested in your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always, I'd greatly appreciate it. First of all, we've got to talk practice real quick. Verstappen, immediately things looked better for Red Bull, and there was talk actually that it's not necessarily they brought the wrong rear wing, because yesterday this was discussed by many in the media, and even by Red Bull themselves, that they'd not got the rear wing they wanted. But I think the reality is, they've not even really created Red Bull a Monza spec rear wing for the last few years, because, well, their DRS used to be so good compared to the competition that it was outrageous, and they could run in Monza with a higher downforce spec rear wing, maintain the tyres, still be faster than anyone, no problems at all. That's not the case nowadays, and a lower downforce model they do kind of need. This, I think, is the lowest downforce one that they have. They just hadn't got the setup right of it on the first day on the Friday night, or the Thursday, I guess, technically, in Las Vegas over there, because of the time zones and all that. So they did what they could today to improve that, and they did improve it. But they are still losing compared to where their rivals are with the more kind of viable rear wing. In the race, it's probably not so much of a problem, but in qualifying, it was an issue for Red Bull for sure, and we'll see the top speed data here over the coming minutes. But Red Bull certainly made progress today, but it's not like, you know, we heard Verstappen say this weekend, oh, we're going to finally see the true performance of the cars, because the theory was that McLaren were having like water in their tyres or whatever, and Russell said after yesterday that there was clearly some sort of thing that Mercedes unlocked to take them to the next level, and obviously I expected the Ferrari to be pretty good around here as it was. Now, there was a big drama of today as well, over the last few days really, this preventative skid blocks under the floor. So if you guys are unfamiliar with this, the floor of the car is 1 centimeter thick. There's a plank on the floor. If it wears by more than a millimeter during a race distance, you get disqualified. It's what happened to Hamilton and Leclerc last year's Austin Grand Prix. In order to prevent that, the teams have found various ways to protect it, and this weekend a new TD came into place, preventing them from doing so. Now, the drama around this is because Red Bull asked for the clarification, and they were calling out Mercedes, Ferrari, Haas, seemingly, for using these kind of tricks. Now, what you'll tend to find is when Red Bull are calling out other teams for cheating, 99.9% of the time, they were doing it themselves at some point. And again, that was the case here. So this is kind of the further update to the situation, and exactly why the other teams were so frustrated about it, and also the very entertaining thing about Red Bull Racing. So Red Bull were doing this, and they were concerned that McLaren might lodge a surprise complaint that would see all of the cars disqualified, and therefore, you know, they would run the risk, because if McLaren weren't doing it, then, you know, they were concerned that McLaren might come out and say, hey, Red Bull have been using this trick for months now, get all of their past races, you know, disqualified, which realistically I don't think the FIA were ever going to do. But Red Bull were concerned that they might, because Red Bull or McLaren weren't using this trick to protect the floor, and therefore Red Bull said, okay, we are going to report it ourselves, and therefore preempt this potential protest from McLaren. The funny thing is that apparently McLaren had no idea that you could even do this. So McLaren weren't doing this, and they had no intention of protesting because they were unaware that you even could, which I think in some ways sums up the title fight this year between Red Bull and McLaren, but I thought that was pretty funny. But Ferrari, they're the team that's most frustrated, not because they were cheating and got caught, but because the FIA gave them the permission to do this earlier in the season with their car, and now apparently it's illegal. So Vasseur says 6 days notice was extremely short. The primary issue wasn't raising the car slightly, which the SF24 could handle due to its wide tolerance. The bigger concern was excessive wear on the unprotected mounting screws if the car bottomed out on the track, because the data they didn't have. Basically, Ferrari talked to the FIA about this, and they have approval to do what they did from the FIA earlier in the season. And they therefore thought about just ignoring the directive and continuing as standard, because then if the FIA said, hey, that's against the new rules, they can say, look, you guys gave us permission a few months ago to do this. What are you talking about? And Ferrari were pretty convinced that because they have this written FIA approval on what they were doing, because technically it was legal, it was a loophole, basically. And Red Bull were like, hey, this loophole shouldn't be legit, whatever, the stewards wouldn't be able to disqualify them. That's what Ferrari thought, but Vasseur said, you know what, let's just not get into any of the drama. Let's just remove it from the car and, take the maybe marginal performance hit. So it doesn't seem like it's going to do much. Reportedly, Red Bull, Ferrari, Mercedes, Aston, Haas, even Sauber, Alpine and VCarb have all been doing this. So it's only Williams and McLaren that weren't. And McLaren are probably sitting there thinking, damn, we could have been way better, or at least marginally better, had they been doing this. And it's just funny that Red Bull were concerned that they were going to get disqualified because McLaren were going to do a protest, and McLaren had no idea this was even possible. Therefore, they weren't going to say anything about it. But yeah, that's what was happening there. The reality is that because most teams were affected, we're not probably going to see that much about it. Practice finishes with Stroll. I mean, Aston Martin, such a disaster. They were actually slower in qualifying today than they were last year, and that's a serious indictment. But at the end of practice, Hamilton was fastest for a time, but it was Russell, Mercedes on top again. They've definitely discovered something. I don't know what it is. Russell talked about it after practice. He was like, I can't tell you guys why I'm so happy, but I'm very happy. So they've clearly unlocked something. Part of it may be due to the low temperatures in Las Vegas. We talked about this before earlier in the season with the Mercedes. It does tend to like the lower temperatures more than our higher temperatures. It's kind of cold in Vegas. I don't know how they're going to do in Qatar. It's going to be hot there and Abu Dhabi too. But this is their chance potentially to get a victory from now to the end of the season. And it could have been Hamilton's chance, but not after the result in qualifying. This is notable, however. So, the Red Bulls, they have made some progress on their straight line speed, but in qualifying, they were still 347, 349. Probably the most notable thing is the Mercedes running a bit more downforce, actually, is kind of interesting just to see that they were still so fast and able to maintain some decent top speed numbers. But it's the Alpines that are rapid in a straight line, and to be fair, the Ferraris. This is potentially crucial in terms of race qualification. Trim, Sainz and Gasly may be rather challenging to overtake, I think is the kind of conclusion we might take here. But qualifying gets underway, and within the first few minutes, I mean, Albon didn't have a good first session. Bottas ended up being out. Both of the Aston Martins, absolute disaster. In addition, though, to Sergio Perez. He's done it again. Can you believe it? And at this point, it's just comical, I think. Look, Perez seems like a nice enough guy. I don't wish any, ill on him. I just think it's funny for Red Bull. They've committed to this guy. They seem to think for some reason he's the man for the future, and he's just underperformed every single week for years at this point, within reason. And this was just funny, right? Because Perez gets knocked out in P16 in Q1, just didn't get a good enough lap in, straight up wasn't fast enough. And it's not like the Red Bull was on fire today, but Max was, as he always is, still in the fight for pole. I don't think the Red Bull was ever quite going to get there, and he ends up qualifying behind an Alpine Verstappen. But nonetheless, the Red Bull was obviously good enough for Q3, and that's not what happened there for Perez, out in Q1 again. And even after he was out, the sphere was roasting him. I mean, can you believe it? Not an ideal scenario for, I mean, imagine this, you're Perez, you've just been knocked out in Q1, you're driving around the track, you look up to your left-hand side, you see the sphere, and it's a massive, avatar of you giving yourself the thumbs down. Absolute disaster class. And this is kind of wild. I think Perez, by the way, has had the same, if not one more, Q1 eliminations this year as Verstappen has had in his whole career, or at least in the last 6 years. I think in the last 6 years, Verstappen has had maybe 5 or 6 Q1 eliminations. Perez has had 6 this year, and that is equal to Verstappen, Norris, Piastri, Leclerc, Sainz, Hamilton, and Russell combined. And those are your title rivals. So, yeah, well done at Red Bull. You made your bed. Unfortunately, I think you've got a lie in it. And even yesterday, Checo was kind of put under pressure by Horner. Horner said, we desperately need both cars right up there working as a pair, which we haven't had. Hopefully, Checo can get some strong performances in these last few races. And then today he's out in Q1. So, not ideal. Again, for the last 3 races in a row, Mexico, Brazil, and now in Las Vegas, both Liam Lawson and Yuki Tsunoda have out-qualified Sergio Perez. So that's just the way that things currently stand at Red Bull Racing, but let's talk about the way that qualifying gets underway. So Q2 goes through, and I mean, Fair play to Zhou, by the way. He actually put in a stellar performance here, and it seems like Sauber have made some progress with their car. But again, it was Hamilton, Verstappen, the McLaren seemed pretty good here. Russell didn't get a great first lap in, but in the end, it was kind of good enough. At this point, we see Russell goes purple. He actually didn't get Russell the best final sector here. He was on for an absolute monster lap time here in Q2, and definitely a sign of things to come for Mercedes. I don't know why Mercedes are so good all of a sudden again, because they've been struggling every single round since the summer break. But it will be a good sign for Russell, for obviously Antonelli, and for Mercedes next year as to what they can potentially do. So yeah, Russell puts in a 1:32.8. Hamilton's just behind. There's Leclerc, Verstappen, all the usual suspects in the conversation. And fair play to Zhou. The car looked actually decent underneath him. He wasn't far away from making it out of Q2, actually. He puts in a lap that was good enough for P11 at the time. And he ends up P13, I believe, after some of these other laps come through. Obviously, Gasly made it ahead of him. But, yeah, great lap from Zhou. So, nice to see him at least have some decent outing in that terrible Sauber car. But a big drama happened here. So, Colapinto and Williams again in the wall. By this time, Hamilton had gone fastest. Sainz, Russell, like a 1:32.5 for Hamilton. A very competitive lap time, as we'll see here over the coming minutes when it comes down to the time that eventually secured pole position. But Colapinto, he was pushing hard through the final sector. The end of the Las Vegas strip, comes through that left-right chicane, cuts the corner too much on the inside, hits the inside wall, just a driver error with the front left tyre. Breaks the front suspension, slams into the wall on the right-hand side, 50G impact, and another absolute disaster for Williams. Apparently, it was $3 million to repair all of the damage in Brazil. And now they've got another massive job overnight. And this is the issue, right? It's like, look, Colapinto's quick. He's quicker than Sargent. But if you total up the number of incidents that he's had over the last few rounds, it's not been great. Brazil wasn't good. He wasn't really that fast in Mexico. And now we've got this in Vegas. It's not just Sargent's fault, or not just Colapinto's fault, because it's all of their fault. It's Sargent, it's Colapinto, and it's Albon that have all contributed at times quite a lot this season. But yeah, you've got to feel bad for the boys in the Williams garage who have got to deal with this drama again. I don't know if they've got to have any money left at this point, honestly. But yeah, it was a 50G impact for Colapinto, so thankfully it seems that he's okay. But yeah, just another situation for Williams that they really could not afford to have, and they're back at it again. But Yuki Tsunoda makes it through to Q3. He had a sensational qualifying again, out-qualifies Liam Lawson, and it's just Yuki sitting here thinking, what can I do at this point? Perez is just driving terribly. Tsunoda is, I wouldn't say he's necessarily underrated by the community. I think that people recognize that Yuki's very good, and okay, he has his blow-up moments, but he's obviously very fast. And I think, if you ask the community whether they'd put Tsunoda in the Red Bull over Checo, I think they'd give you yes, no-brainer. Red Bull obviously don't think so he's certainly underrated to them. But Q3 gets underway. And this was, again, where things started to get very interesting for especially Lewis Hamilton. The funny thing is about this whole Mercedes situation, Hamilton and Russell were nip and tuck. Hamilton was generally faster really the entire weekend. We get to Q3, and it was really no surprise to anybody watching that Hamilton had a very hard time in Q3. It's been a very consistent trend this entire year, and part of it has to be in his head. I think there's no doubt about that in my mind, that on some level Hamilton, is getting to Q3 and struggling with a few things. But there's also been some interesting theories, hasn't there, this season, that, the tyre blankets weren't up to temperature or whatever, the tyres are coming out of the blankets, the emails that were sent to Mercedes that they were sabotaging or whatever. I don't really know. But here we are again, and in Q3, the Mercedes was the fastest car out there. Russell puts in a 1:32.8. Notably, of course, Hamilton did a 1:32.5 in Q2, just a few minutes before. Ahead of Sainz, ahead of Verstappen, ahead of Norris, but of course everyone bangs on the tyres. The first lap though, Hamilton was on a good lap, he was on pretty good pace, was basically on Russell's pace, and then he had a moment into turn 14, locked up the front left, and that was that lap basically over. And then on his second attempt, this was through just the first couple of corners when he loses the rear end. We know that the rear end of the Mercedes can be volatile, and if there's any part of the car that Hamilton was going to lose in an instant like this, it was going to be the rear ends. But you could argue Hamilton was probably just pushing too hard in this corner, maybe to make up for lost time or whatever. I don't know. It's just very interesting though that Hamilton seemed super dialed in and on it basically all weekend, in full control and confidence with the car. and then turns up to Q3, and all of a sudden the rear end is giving away through a corner that he's not struggled with all weekends. So there's definitely, it's interesting, isn't it? Like, you can look at it either way. To me, it's more likely that there's a mix of both here, right? When there is maybe something on with the car, or there's some changes that are being made, or just the conditions when it gets to really, crunch time in Q3, when the track is mostly rubbered in, although that wasn't even fully the case here because of such a delay on clearing up from Colapinto's mess with the red flag, basically, at the end of the final qualifying bit in Q2. Hamilton or the W15 is struggling with something, right? And there's also an argument that he might be pushing too hard. I mean, there's a theory that these current Formula 1 cars with the ground effect regulations, if you push them too hard, as in, okay, final run, let's absolutely commit to the lap, they actually sometimes don't like that as much. You have to almost drive slightly within yourself to get the fastest lap times. That's been talked about by many drivers before, and maybe that's what's Hamilton to Hamilton consistently here in Q3. But as he says, big mistake, and honestly, he was kind of lucky not to be in the wall. Like, he was basically full opposite lock through this very fast right-hander, and at that point the lap was basically over. Ends up P10, but obviously, Hamilton struggling, but at the same time, we've got great laps going in elsewhere. Yuki puts in a 1:33.0 to go P6 at the time. Verstappen then leapfrogs him. Russell puts in a lap good enough to get pole position, but Sainz put in a mesmerizingly good 1:32.4. But as we see, Hamilton's lap in Q2 would have been good enough for third place on the grid here. Like, it was faster than Gasly, faster than Leclerc, faster than both of the McLarens, of course, and Hülkenberg ends up P9 ahead of Hamilton, and yeah, Russell snatches pole on the line with a 1:32.3. Sainz with a great lap in the Ferrari. Leclerc again wasn't happy with his tyre temperatures, and it's going to be pretty interesting to see what happens at Ferrari next year between Leclerc and Hamilton, because both guys that have struggled this year at times getting the tyres quite in the right window for qualifying. Leclerc has struggled with that a bit. Sainz is seemingly, it's all about tyres. Like, Sainz isn't a 3/10, 4/10 of a second a lap faster driver than Leclerc. Like, we know what history says about their rivalry within that team. It's that Sainz did a much better job, or, the car did a much better job. I don't know. The Pirelli tyres do seem to be a mystery to the teams, getting them into the right temperature window. But obviously the standout team is Gasly, right? How has that happened? How is Gasly at an Alpine out-qualified his teammate by miles and stuck at P3 on the grid? We know that they've got good straight line speed. They don't have much power. That's the funny thing about the Alpine. They're down on power, but they do have good straight line speeds. And he sticks in a lap good enough for third place on the grid. Absolutely unbelievable scenes. So Gasly's been killing it lately. And fair play to Alpine somehow turning their season around from what was literally the worst car on the grid at Bahrain testing this year. Leclerc was fuming about the tyres. Obviously, he ends up P4. And it's not like Verstappen had a good quali either. He ends P5. But ahead of the McLarens. That's the crucial thing. The McLaren that we saw, it was bad around here last year. And it's bad around here again, at least compared to the top guys. For whatever reason, the McLaren in these kind of scenarios, the cold temperatures, whatever it is, just doesn't quite deliver the performance they want. But fair play to Russell. I mean, the car was great this weekend. Russell was there to deliver. And he got the job done in Q3 when Hamilton didn't. And his qualifying record over the last few rounds has been very impressive indeed. I actually would go further on to say that Russell's the most underrated qualifier. I'd probably say that he might be the most underrated driver on the grid right now. I think there's a compelling case you can make for that. He might not be the most well-liked, but Russell is there to deliver on many occasions, and I think he's just done a killer job on most regards this season. And yeah, his race pace, his racecraft, there are questions there. Hamilton's still certainly stronger in that regard, but in terms of qualifying and many other factors, in terms of picking up the pieces at times as well, Russell's done a great job this season, and I don't think he gets the credit that he deserves at times. This was Max, not the happiest man on the grid after that qualifying result, but at the end of the day, all he's got to do is finish ahead of Lando, or potentially take Lando out of the race, because the current gap is 62 points. So the gap, if it's 60 points after this round, it's over. So if Lando doesn't score points and Max doesn't score points, it's GG, championship to Verstappen. Lando was talking about it and obviously sarcastically saying it's not the tyres because they're too hot or too cold. It's all nonsense, all the water. Our car just doesn't suit these conditions. He said it's incredible, especially because we are the fastest car by a mile, right? Because obviously that's what people have been saying. So yeah, it's weird. Maybe it's water in the tyres that obviously McLaren were accused of. And well, look, in qualifying that wouldn't matter anyway because the tyre temps are more relevant over a race stint. But that's what McLaren were being accused of by Red Bull. Lando reckons there's nothing of the sort. And even I think Lando went on to say that the title race was lost in the first 6 races rather than lost over, the last few rounds. Look, the reality is, if Lando had won the races that he potentially should have won when the car was the fastest, Hungary, Barcelona, maybe Austria, even Imola, you could potentially argue, Kota, Brazil, had he won those rounds, then, the title was definitely still on, and it was only a couple of rounds ago they were swapping Piastri and Norris. Obviously the title was still on, but look, whatever. Lando and McLaren can say what they want to say. Perez was obviously pretty gutted about it and says, I think we've got a fundamental issue at the moment with the car that is just not working for me. There is a fundamental issue with that car, and it might be in the cockpit, unfortunately, right now. And Toto was of mixed opinions, right? Because obviously it was great for Mercedes, Russell on pole position, but Hamilton was kind of nowhere near. And it was interesting Hamilton's reaction here, because, his reaction initially wasn't too negative. I think he's pretty confident that, because the pace is clearly there. All the weekends, Hamilton has the pace, apart from Q3, as it stands. And as he says, I'm quite far back. Degradation's going to be key. Congrats to George. It is what it is. It's been a good weekend. And he says, yeah, it didn't work when it mattered. I should have been on pole. I think this is always the thing about Hamilton. Whatever he thinks about Russell, he obviously knows Russell's good. But Hamilton, when the car is good, will always back himself to be better than Russell. As will Russell on Hamilton, obviously. But, Hamilton's there saying, look, if I'd have got the laps in, which he didn't, but if he had have done, he would have been faster than George. That's basically what he's saying. I've got pace, he says, and the race is probably done given where he's starting. But then he went on to say this: the car felt different in Q3. The stability was not there for some reason, but I had it in all of the other sessions. Ultimately, though, I didn't put the laps together. So he takes, some responsibility for sure for the poor performance in Q3, but he says, look, the car was different again. It was good up until then, and since we got to Q3, it just started snapping away. So what's going on here, right? What is actually going on? Is it all in Hamilton's head? Is there something to it? I'm tempted to think there's a bit of both. But it's just such a consistent trend at this point that even if it's not in Hamilton's head, it will be getting there, right? Just because, he'll be turning up to Q3 thinking, oh, bloody hell, last time I was in Q3, this happened, and he's in Q3 again, and, well, here we go again. Same old story, really. And I don't think anyone's massively surprised, for whatever reason, that the the qualifying session ended for Hamilton in the way that it did. So, I think this is why the move to Ferrari is going to be super beneficial for Hamilton, because it will just get all those kind of demons out of his head, right? It's okay, go to Ferrari, they're not sabotaging anything, it's me and Leclerc, and that'll potentially be a pretty sizable litmus test, right? Max wasn't happy either, but he did say, look, this is all we can do. We're slow on the straight, especially in quali. Our rear wing is trimmed down, but we don't have the gain like the others do when we open the flap. So how times have changed on that one. I wonder if Red Bull were doing anything I wouldn't say illegal, but how have they gone from having a DRS advantage, which was just so mega compared to everyone else? Maybe others have caught up. Others have definitely caught up. But it used to be outrageous how good Red Bull's DRS was, and now Max is saying that it's basically the worst. It's what's happened there? Got to be something in that. But this is going to be your starting grid for tomorrow's race. Of course, tomorrow morning here in the UK and in Europe, tomorrow or tonight, I guess, if you're watching this in America, and well, at least in, let's say, West Coast, Las Vegas time, stuff like that. This is your grid. Bottas with his penalty anyway. Stroll, Albon, Alonso, Perez, Lawson ends up 15th, whereas Tsunoda was in 7th. A big statement I thought there from Yuki today. Colapinto, Zhou, Magnus and Ocon, Hamilton in 10th. Then we get the two McLaren guys. Norris, of course, needs to overtake and beat Max tomorrow if he wants to keep the championship alive. That seems pretty challenging to happen, but it would be amazing if Verstappen wins the championship tomorrow without even finishing on the podium, which seems pretty likely right now, because you'd expect Gasly is going to drop back somewhat in the race, but he might be difficult to overtake because he's got pretty damn good straight line speeds. Sainz and Leclerc will potentially work together to try and get Russell, which I might expect them to. I think that in terms of race trim, I have lots of confidence in that Ferrari, and they qualified well today. And who knows what Max can do from 5th on the grid. He's qualified 5th before. He's never won from 5th, despite having won from more positions on the grid than any other driver. But very much interested in your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care, and I'll see you next time.